Hey, Crystal Maiden here, doing post-commentary over Sonic 3D Blast. But it's not the version of it that you all know. What I'm playing is a ROM hack called Sonic 3D Blast with Supersonic. Because, unfortunately, after Sonic 3 and Knuckles, they made it so that you can't play as Supersonic in the actual levels anymore. So this ROM hack adds that back in. And 3D Blast is kind of weird in that even when you fight the final boss, you don't have Supersonic. Which really makes me wonder why they force you to have all the Chaos Emeralds to fight the final boss. But yeah, here's the plot of the game. Dialogue is so stilted here. Robotnik, make my friends like this. I must save them. Robotnik must be stopped. That looks like he's literally reading from a script. He sounds so unenthusiastic. I guess it's a good thing they weren't voice acting. But yeah, that's the plot of this game. There's these magical birds that Eggman's after because apparently they can go through dimensions with these giant rings. Not really sure how they made those rings when they don't have opposable thumbs. But whatever. And in the original, in most of the versions of Sonic 3D Blast that people play, you're forced to defeat robots in order to rescue Flickies. And you have to collect all the Flickies and then jump through a giant ring to progress with the level. And that means that the game can get really dull and boring and repetitive very quickly because you're forced to constantly collect all of the enemies, defeat all the enemies and get all of the Flickies. So you have to explore the entire level. Yeah, I don't know why I was having such a hard time breaking through that wall. This is an isometric platformer, which means that depth perception is kind of an impossibility. You can't really tell near from far very well with the kind of camera angle that this has. Isometric platforming does not work. It just doesn't, because it doesn't have the proper camera angle for it. That's why I was never able to beat Super Mario RPG. As much as I loved the game, I couldn't get past the final Bowser's Castle platforming section with all the lava and everything, because I just kept falling into the lava, mistiming and misjudging how far I was supposed to jump. Thankfully, there isn't that much platforming in this game. Like, I feel like Super Mario RPG was a lot worse with the isometric platforming. This game is more about just going through the level. And behold, the easiest special stage in Sonic history. All you do is walk forward and collect the rings. And it's so narrow that it's easy to collect the rings even without trying, because there's only the tiny amount of space that the rings can be at. Obviously, you want to avoid running into the mines because they'll take away rings from you. And a good idea is to let the walls stop you, because you'll speed up the longer you keep going forward. And the faster you go, the easier it is for you to run into bombs. It's not like in Knuckles Chaotix, where if you let yourself get stopped by a wall and don't jump over it, then you'll get stuck there and not be able to progress with the rest of the special stage. That's why I was so reluctant to let myself slow down and get stopped by the walls. I didn't want to get stuck. But that's not really gonna happen in this game. But yeah, I'm gonna be getting all the Chaos Emeralds. And I felt like I wouldn't be properly showing off the game if I didn't show off how Supersonic works in this game. Even though it's a ROM hack that I have to use to show off Supersonic. I feel like this is the best way to play the game, because in the Supersonic ROM hack, as well as 3D No Flickies, which Sonic 3D No Flickies is what this Supersonic ROM hack was based off of. And I feel like this is the best way to play the game, because you don't have to go through the entire level collecting Flickies. The only reason I'm exploring all the levels is so that I can get as many rings as I can, so that I can so that I can collect all the Chaos Emeralds as fast as possible. Because it's going to be hard to collect the Chaos Emeralds later in the game, so I want to collect them early. And this is the Golden Shield, and it gives you a homing attack. This is the first Sonic game to have any sort of homing attack. Tails and Knuckles act like a bank that store your rings. Unfortunately, they made it possible that they can steal your rings and not give them back to you without any effect. Because you can still give them rings after you've gotten all the Chaos Emeralds. Which is especially problematic in this game, because you need 50 rings saved up to turn to Super Sonic. And you don't want to give away your rings, because then you won't be able to do that. And it sucks that you can deposit more than 50 rings in them. And you need 50 rings deposited into them to access the special stages, presumably because they need the magic of 50 rings, ring energy, in order to access the special stage. Because ring energy is sort of like a weaker chaos energy. So it makes sense that you need 50 rings to access the special stages. So it kind of seems suspect that you're paying them to let you go into special stages, but also they act like separate things. They're separate from each other. So you pay Tails, and the money will go to Tails and not Knuckles. So you don't want to waste money on one. You don't want to spread it out between them. You want to go all on one and then go all on another. I hate when I lose that, because the Golden Shield is really great. It's really great saving up. Yeah, and I really should have just collected a little bit of money so that I had that little extra cash to give to Tails, and then collected the rest of the money and given it to Knuckles. But unfortunately, I didn't do that. This game was released on the Genesis, the PC, and a console called the Sega Saturn. And there's a lot of differences between this game and the Saturn version of the game. One of them is that in the Saturn version, you can't collect multiple different Chaos Emeralds in one act, which really sucks because it forces you to collect all the Chaos Emeralds later in the game, and it's harder to collect all the Chaos Emeralds later in the game because it's easy to get hit, especially with the kind of slippery controls that you have where you're always sliding around like you're on ice, and you can't do an instant 180-degree turn. You just sort of turn to the side when you're trying to hold back. So that's one of the biggest problems I have with this game, is that you have very slippery controls. It can be alleviated somewhat by just jumping around. You hold down the B button while you're moving and you'll start rolling. And it's safer to roll into enemies rather than jumping on them, because with the isometric platforming, with the kind of depth perception you have, which is saying none, the only way that you can easily land on top of enemies is to pay attention to where your shadow is below you. And if your shadow is directly over the head of an enemy, then you know you're going to land on it. But it's a lot easier to just roll into them. Although, it's also easy to get hit when you're trying to roll into them because you hold down the B button too late. Those mines are annoying because if you walk into them, they explode, and it's surreal because looking at them when they explode, it kind of looks like they've got exploded bits of flickies coming out of them. Oh boy. But yeah, this is basically the game. You're exploring the entire level, defeating all the enemies, collecting all the flickies. And the really annoying thing is that if you get hit while Flicky is following you, it'll scatter away from you. And then you'll have to move around a little to make sure that you recollect it. Although it could be worse, the Flickies could go really far away from you and respawn back where they were before. That would really suck. But there are multiple different types of Flickies, and some are more annoying than others. The Flickies you find here aren't that big of a deal, they're easy to get back. The red Flickies are really annoying because they constantly bounce all over the place. Some of the Flickies actively avoid you, and it's really hard to get them back. I hate that enemy because it's easy to get hit by it. This game has a Saturn version to it. And in the Saturn version of the game, there are plenty of differences that it has. But maybe I should start by talking about exactly what the Saturn is. The Saturn was a 32-bit CD-ROM disc-using device. It was a console that was initially successful in Japan because it had a whole bunch of good games for it in Japan. But it flopped in America because of its surprise May 1995 launch, 4 months before its scheduled release date, when it didn't really have many games out for it yet. That's right, they actually decided, they were like in a press conference, surprise, the Saturn's actually out. And all of the people in charge of making games for it were confused, like, huh? Why are you announcing it so early? We haven't gotten any games out for it. Do you not have faith in the console? And so nobody bought it because there weren't any games for it yet. And so the Saturn flopped in America because they released it too early. The Saturn also has a mixed reputation because of its limited third-party support, so there weren't that many good games for it, and it had a really complex hardware design. That's why it wasn't until July 2016 when the Saturn was finally cracked. It's very good that people finally managed to crack it because while cartridge-based games like those for the Genesis still work decades later, these days the old disc readers of the Saturns of the world are starting to fail from old age. Thankfully, an engineer called James bought a Saturn in Japan and tried to make it read games via USB. And he made a ROM reading cartridge for the Game Boy called Dragon Derp. I guess he had a sense of humor. And the reason that the Saturn was so hard to crack by hackers is that each of its games had a physical mark on them that the disc reader had to detect to check to see if it was a real Saturn game. That made the Saturn very hard to pirate. And so Saturn emulation is really difficult to do and a lot of people can't get it working. The engineer James, how do I pronounce that name? Laird Waugh? I'll just call him James Waugh. He bypassed the disk drive completely because he was able to read and write files from a USB drive to a running system, and that allowed users to play and save games with the USB drive. He calls himself Dr. Abrasive for some reason, and he ensured that the Saturn and its games will be saved from eventual extinction, because if you don't, you gotta understand that eventually it's gonna be impossible to play Saturn games legitimately, because all of the disk drives and all the real Saturns are gonna fail, and no one's gonna be able to play them. So eventually, the only way anyone will be able to play Saturn games is on an emulator. So I think it's a good thing that they're making Saturn emulation better, because it saves them from eventual extinction. Make sure that people will always be able to play them. And like, not everyone owns a Saturn. Saturn's really expensive and hard to get nowadays. There are plenty of good games for Saturn that people will never be able to play because it's so hard to get a Saturn and the games are ridiculously expensive. The Dreamcast, which was essentially the GameCube of Sega, but a little less powerful. The Dreamcast didn't have the anti-piracy disc measure of the Saturn because it was rushed to market to compete with the current generation of consoles. And it flopped before it came out. It flopped because it came out only a year after the Saturn, and people didn't want to buy a new Sega console a year later. That and Sega didn't really have the money to add that disc reader to the Dreamcast in the first place because they're already going bankrupt. But yeah, that's basically what the Saturn is. It's a 32-bit console that is more graphically powerful than the Genesis. I like how they have an effect on the boss fights where the Eggmobile's blast stone very clearly cracks and shows signs of damage the more you hit it. I love that. It makes it feel like you're progressing. Every boss in this game takes 8 hits to kill, which is the standard for Sonic games. This boss is pretty easy. You gotta dodge his spiked ball and jump at him exactly right. It can be kind of hard because of the isometric perspective, but it's not really that big of a deal. See you in the next part.